When Joseph arrived, the air shifted. The alien guards at the landing platform straightened, instinctively sensing something they couldn't name. He emerged alone, cutting a stark figure against the cold metal. The man moved with precision, every step deliberate, shoulders square beneath a crisp, black suit that seemed incongruous with the galaxy's vibrant eccentricity. He carried no visible weapons, no entourage, only a small diplomatic case held effortlessly in his left hand. One of the guards, a tall, serpentine creature with translucent skin, sneered as it approached. Its language was guttural, a series of clicks and hisses translated by a floating holographic orb. "You are late, human." Joseph tilted his head slightly, as though examining the alien for the first time. His expression remained blank, save for his eyes. Two cold, dark wells that the guard found impossible to meet for long. "Traffic," he said flatly. The guard blinked its lidless eyes in confusion, unsure if this was humor or insolence. With a sharp motion, it gestured toward the entrance, as though swatting away an insect. "Move. The Admiral is waiting." Joseph walked forward without comment. If he noticed the phalanx of heavily armed guards shadowing him, their weapons discreetly trained on his back, he gave no sign. He moved like someone accustomed to the silence of rooms where decisions were made, where lives were weighed and discarded with pen strokes. That quiet confidence unsettled the aliens more than they cared to admit. Inside, the Imperial facility's grandeur was designed to dwarf and intimidate. Vast halls rose into cavernous ceilings. Alien statues stood like sentinels against obsidian walls, their elongated faces twisted in eternal fury. Joseph's polished shoes echoed faintly as he was led into the command chamber, a room dominated by a single circular table surrounded by high-ranking officials of the Empire. At its center, a holographic map of the disputed region flickered in red and green light. Admiral Threx loomed at the far side of the table, tall even by his species standards. He bore the look of a creature carved from living granite. His armor fused to his thick, sinewy frame, sharp ridges of bone visible along his skull. When Joseph entered, the room fell silent. The Admiral spoke without preamble. "You are the representative Earth sends to negotiate peace." Joseph set the diplomatic case on the table with a soft click. "I am." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the aliens, a low, contemptuous sound that bounced off the chamber's walls. Threx's lips peeled back in what passed for a grin. "Peace. A human word. Your kind speaks of peace because you lack the strength for war." Joseph's gaze didn't waver. "We speak of peace because war is costly." The Admiral leaned forward, his massive fists slamming onto the table with enough force to rattle the holographic projector. "You have no leverage here. This border world belongs to the Empire. You have no claim. You are a nuisance. Tolerated, perhaps, but insignificant." Joseph said nothing. The silence that followed dragged long enough for the aliens to fidget in their seats, their earlier confidence fraying. "Perhaps you misunderstand your place," Threx growled, rising to his full height. "Or perhaps you're here for another reason." The doors to the chamber hissed open behind Joseph. A squad of elite guards entered in perfect formation, their armor gleaming black, weapons crackling with lethal energy. The aliens in the room sat straighter, watching the scene unfold with sadistic curiosity. "You are under arrest," Threx said. "Earth will be informed of its diplomats' crimes against the Empire. They will learn what happens when vermin trespass on Imperial matters." Joseph turned his head just enough to glance at the guards. His expression remained neutral, though there was a faint twitch in his jaw, so subtle it almost went unnoticed. For the first time, an officer at the table felt a flicker of unease. The human stillness wasn't fear, it was calculation. "On what grounds?" Joseph asked quietly. Threx smiled. "Treason, espionage, assassination." He waved a dismissive hand. "The charges do not matter. You will disappear. Your kind will take the lesson to heart." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Joseph sighed, a small, almost imperceptible sound that somehow carried through the entire chamber. "I would advise against this," he said. Threx's grin faltered. "What did you say?" Joseph turned to face the guards fully, his hands relaxed at his sides. "I said you should let me go." He looked back at the admiral. Before this gets out of hand, the tension in the room shifted. Several officers exchanged confused glances. The guards hesitated, awaiting orders. One of them, a towering brute with forearms and a reputation for cruelty, stepped forward and reached for Joseph's shoulder. Joseph moved. It happened faster than their alien eyes could process. One moment, the guard's hand extended. The next, his arm was snapped backward at a grotesque angle. The sound, a sharp, wet pop, echoed through the chamber, followed immediately by the alien's agonized roar. Joseph sidestepped another guard's lunge, seized the barrel of a plasma rifle, and redirected its discharge into the chest of its wielder. A blinding bolt of energy cut across the room, dropping the second guard in a heap of smoldering armor. The chamber exploded into chaos. "Stop him," Threx bellowed, his voice cracking in disbelief. Officers stumbled backward, clawing at their chairs to escape the sudden violence. Joseph was a blur of movement, every strike deliberate, every action efficient. A knife materialized from one guard's belt. Joseph disarmed him in an instant, sending the blade plunging into another's throat with a practiced flick of his wrist. In less than a minute, the elite squad lay sprawled across the chamber floor, broken, bleeding, and silent. Joseph stood at the center of the carnage, his suit immaculate save for a single smear of alien blood along his sleeve. Admiral Threx stared, paralyzed. "What are you?" Joseph adjusted his cufflinks and met the admiral's gaze. For the first time, he smiled, a faint, joyless curve of his lips. "You shouldn't have done that," he said softly. The doors hissed open once more, but this time Joseph didn't wait. He turned and walked out, leaving the stunned silence of the chamber behind him. Somewhere in the distance, alarms began to blare. The Galactic prison, known as Blackreach, was a tomb carved into the heart of an asteroid, a labyrinth of steel and stone buried beneath kilometers of rock. It had been designed to contain the galaxy's worst nightmares: warlords, traitors, and assassins who had threatened the Empire's order. Escape was impossible, its reputation forged in centuries of silence. No one left Blackreach. They simply disappeared. Joseph sat alone in his cell, a narrow rectangle of cold gray metal sealed by an energy field that hummed softly. There was no bed, no comforts, only a low bench built into the wall. The light above flickered in uneven intervals, bathing the cell in a dull, sickly glow. Outside, the rhythmic stomp of guards' boots echoed faintly, monotonous and unyielding, like the heartbeat of the prison itself. His hands rested on his knees, palms relaxed, fingers motionless. To any observer, he looked utterly still, a statue abandoned in the dark. His breathing came slow and steady, and his eyes, dark and unblinking, remained fixed on the opposite wall. It was as though he were listening for something beyond the cold silence. 2 guards passed the cell, their voices a guttural series of clicks and growls punctuated by cruel laughter. One of them, a reptilian creature with overlapping armor-like scales, paused and tapped the energy field's control panel. The barrier flickered briefly as the guard leaned close. "You are quiet for a species that screams," the guard hissed, its translator crackling to life. Its slit-pupil eyes narrowed, searching for a reaction. "Your kind always screams." Joseph didn't move. The second guard, a hulking brute with translucent skin that pulsed with glowing veins, smirked and crossed its thick arms. "They say you killed 10 men in the Admiral's chamber." Its voice was deeper, a gravelly rumble. "I don't believe it. You're just a human." Still, Joseph said nothing. The reptilian guard slammed its armored fist against the energy field, sending ripples of light across its surface. "Say something," it snarled. Joseph lifted his gaze, just slightly, and looked at the reptilian. There was no anger, no threat, only a stillness that ran too deep to comprehend. The guard flinched, pulling back instinctively. The translucent brute chuckled, muttering something about broken humans, but they moved on, their footfalls disappearing into the distance. Left alone again, Joseph exhaled quietly, the sound no more than a whisper. He had been here before. In places like this, where walls pressed in and the air grew stale, where cruelty was casual and silence was its own weapon. Blackreach was no different, though its architects would claim otherwise. A faint vibration ran through the floor, a tremor so small it might have been the workings of the asteroid itself. Joseph tilted his head, listening. He counted the beats between vibrations, mapping the facility in his mind. Somewhere above, turbines whined, circulating air recycled so many times it tasted metallic. The guards rotated patrols every 30 minutes. He noted that by the shift in their steps, power conduits hummed faintly through the walls, pulsing like veins in a great, slumbering beast. Every sound told him something. Every detail mattered. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time lost meaning in places like this. Joseph remained seated unmoving as guards continued their rounds. They stopped taunting him after a while, unnerved by his silence. He became, in their eyes, less of a prisoner and more of a fixture, a lifeless object tucked away behind a glowing wall. That suited him fine. It wasn't until the warden arrived that the calm broke. The warden of Blackreach was a figure spoken of in low whispers, even among imperial officers. A tall, sinewy being of the Xyrax race, he wore a cloak of living black fibers that twisted and writhed with a life of their own. His face was an expressionless mask of bone, its surface etched with intricate runes that pulsed faintly when he moved. He carried no weapons. He didn't need them. Joseph heard the approach before he saw it. The guard's footsteps were hurried now, punctuated by the sharp, deliberate click of the warden's boots. The energy field around the cell powered down with a deep hum, and the temperature seemed to drop as the warden stepped inside. "You are an anomaly," the warden said. His voice was neither deep nor loud, but it carried a weight that pressed against the ears, each syllable sharp as a blade. He regarded Joseph with a slow tilt of his head, those hollow sockets where eyes should be seeming to peer into something beyond flesh. 10 of my men are dead because of you. Admirable, in its own way. Joseph blinked once, but offered no reply. The warden stepped closer, the black tendrils of his cloak slithering across the floor. "It would be easier if you cooperated. Tell me your secrets, your purpose. Earth is insignificant, yet you," he gestured with a long, clawed hand, "are not." "Why?" Joseph stared at the warden for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, as though he were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "You don't want to know." The warden's cloak writhed violently, reacting to some unseen signal. "I think I do." He moved closer still, until he loomed over Joseph. Without warning, the warden reached out and placed a clawed hand against Joseph's forehead. The bone mask glowed brighter, and a tremor seemed to pass through the walls themselves. A wave of pressure surged through Joseph's mind, alien and invasive, like claws scraping against his skull. The warden was probing, searching for something buried deep, for the truth hidden behind the man's calm exterior. Joseph's jaw clenched. His vision swam as the pressure grew sharper, relentless, pushing deeper. Flashes of memory surged against his will, brief, violent fragments of a past he had buried. The cries of men in darkened rooms, the glint of blades under flickering lights, the dull, final thud of bodies hitting the ground. The warden froze. Joseph looked up, his eyes meeting the hollow sockets of the mask. Slowly, the pressure eased, the glow fading, as the warden pulled his hand back. The tendrils of his cloak fell still. "What are you?" the warden whispered, something like uncertainty creeping into his voice. Joseph rose to his feet. The motion was smooth, unhurried, but it seemed to fill the room. For the first time, the warden stepped back. "You should have killed me," Joseph said quietly. He rolled his shoulders, the muscles under his suit shifting like steel cables drawn taut. "Because now I'm going to kill you." The warden's mask dimmed further, and the cloak writhed violently, lashing at the air as though tasting the growing tension. Outside the cell, alarms began to blare, echoing through the prison's corridors. Red lights strobed across the walls, the dull hum of the facility replaced by the sharp, wailing sirens of an emergency lockdown. The warden hissed a command to the guards, his voice crackling through their comm systems. "Seal the facility. Stop him." But it was already too late. Joseph stepped forward. In one swift motion, he seized the warden's wrist, twisting it sharply enough to crack bone. The alien shrieked, its cloak thrashing wildly as Joseph drove his elbow into its chest, sending the warden sprawling backward into the hall. Joseph stepped into the corridor as the first guards arrived, plasma rifles raised, armor gleaming. They hesitated only for a moment, the disbelief clear in their movements, before opening fire. Joseph moved faster. A twist here, a broken limb there. He seized a rifle, turned it against them, and the hall filled with bursts of energy and panicked screams. The alarms screamed louder. Blackreach had held monsters for centuries. But now, the prison was bleeding, and the man they had locked away was free. The alarm screeched through the bowels of Blackreach as Joseph Walker strode down the corridor, his footsteps measured unhurried. The wailing sirens reverberated off the steel walls, warning the guards, warning the prisoners, warning the asteroid itself, that something had gone terribly wrong. Behind him, the crumpled body of the warden lay motionless, his cloak of writhing fibers now nothing but limp strands across the floor. The creature had underestimated him, as all of them had. Ahead, the corridor split into a maze of twisting halls, identical save for the dull red lights strobing across their surfaces. A dozen armored guards appeared from the far end, rifles raised, glowing barrels aimed at his head. They barked orders in harsh alien tongues, their voices distorted by their helmets. "Stop! Kneel!" Joseph kept walking. The rifles lit up, plasma bolts streaking toward him like furious comets. With practiced grace, he sidestepped the first volley, the searing heat of the blast grazing his suit but leaving him untouched. In a fluid motion, he dove to his left, grabbing the fallen rifle of a guard he'd dispatched earlier. The weapon hummed to life in his hands. He squeezed the trigger. The gun belched bolts of emerald plasma, each shot finding its mark. The first guard staggered backward. A smoking hole burned through his chest plate. The second fell without a sound, his helmet shattering like glass. Joseph moved through them like a shadow, relentless, untouchable. He dropped the rifle once it was empty, its power core depleted, and closed the distance. A sharp elbow to one guard's throat, a precise snap of another's arm. Alien bodies hit the ground one after another, their armor clattering like broken machinery. When the last one fell, Joseph stood alone in the blood-smeared corridor, his breathing steady, his eyes cold. Somewhere deeper in the prison, the echo of heavy boots and shouted commands told him reinforcements were closing in. He glanced down at the guards' weapons, kicked one aside, and picked up another, this one larger, built for suppression. It fit awkwardly in his hands, alien in design, but he adjusted to it with quiet efficiency. He didn't have time to fight every guard in Blackreach. If the Empire's prison complex operated like any other fortress, there was a central control room, and that's where he needed to go. Security systems, lockdowns, and defenses would all run through that nexus. With control of it, he could open the cells, release the prisoners into the corridors, turn the Empire's own monstrosities loose. It wasn't a plan born of mercy. Joseph Walker knew violence. He knew what chaos could accomplish when applied with precision. The path to the control center was a gauntlet. Armored reinforcements poured into the halls, plasma fire carving glowing gouges into walls and doors. Joseph ducked, rolled, and advanced with ruthless efficiency. Every shot he fired ended a life. Every step he took brought him closer to his goal. He discarded weapons the moment they ran dry, scooping up new ones from fallen guards without breaking stride. 2 soldiers, a pair of hulking creatures with razor-tipped gauntlets, rushed him from the side. Joseph feinted right, letting one lunge past him, and caught the other by its helmet, slamming its face into the wall hard enough to crack the metal plating. The second spun toward him, swiping low. Joseph kicked the alien's leg out from under it, sending it crashing to the floor, then planted a plasma bolt into the back of its skull. Silence followed, punctuated only by the dying hum of the weapon in his hands. Ahead, the control room's reinforced door loomed, from the heavy plating and energy lock securing it. It was clear the Empire had designed it to withstand prolonged assault. Joseph studied it for half a second, noting the placement of guards stationed at its flanks. 2 turrets mounted in the ceiling above, swiveling to target him as he approached. He moved before they fired. A burst of plasma scorched the air where he had been standing, but Joseph was already rolling to the side. He grabbed a fallen grenade from a dead guard's belt, a clunky, circular device, and hurled it toward the turrets in a single, precise motion. It detonated midair, showering the area with a pulse of searing energy. The turrets exploded in a cascade of sparks, their targeting systems fried. Joseph rushed the door. The guards flanking it turned to fire, but they were too slow. He dropped low, sweeping one's legs out from under him, then drove the butt of his rifle into the other's jaw with bone-cracking force. Blood spattered across the floor as the alien crumpled. The remaining guard tried to crawl away, reaching for his rifle, but Joseph silenced him with a sharp kick to the head. Now the door. The energy locks hissed and clicked, pulsing faintly with a deep blue glow. Joseph spotted the control panel, a complex interface of alien runes and shifting lights, and knelt in front of it. His eyes narrowed as he studied the symbols, his mind processing the system's logic. He'd seen something similar once, on another job, in another life. With a few deliberate motions, his fingers danced across the interface. The glow shifted from blue to red, then blinked out entirely. The door let out a low groan as its seals disengaged, retracting into the floor with a final, metallic thunk. Inside, the control room was a hive of activity. Rows of alien technicians, smaller and frielier than the guards, spun in panic as Joseph entered. Screens lined the walls, displaying camera feeds of the prison. Halls filled with guards scrambling to respond, cells lined with prisoners who watched and waited. For a moment, the technicians froze, their bulbous eyes widening. Joseph fired once into the ceiling. The technicians screamed and scattered, throwing themselves against the walls, hands raised in surrender. He ignored them, his focus on the central console, a massive display pulsing with information. His gaze swept across it, isolating the commands he needed. One button in particular, marked by a symbol flashing angrily, stood out. A simple press, and the prison trembled. The cell doors opened. Across Blackreach, energy fields flickered and died. Locks disengaged and reinforced doors slid open. The prisoners inside, war criminals, assassins, and creatures that had long forgotten the meaning of freedom, staggered into the halls. For a moment, silence held as the imprisoned registered their new reality. Then came the sound of it, the roar of violence surging through the corridors, spreading like wildfire. Joseph stood at the center of the storm he had unleashed, his expression cold, unflinching. On the monitors, he watched guards overwhelmed, their lines collapsing as prisoners turned on them with primal fury. The Empire had sealed its worst nightmares away, and now they were loose, unchecked, unrelenting. A technician whimpered in the corner of the room. You'll die here too, human. You'll never escape." Joseph turned his head just slightly, his eyes locking onto the creature with the weight of inevitability. "I'm not the one who should be worried." As the control room filled with the distant echoes of chaos and death, Joseph turned back to the monitors. Somewhere on the feeds, beyond the prison's collapsing order, lay the hangar, a way out. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his voice low, a whisper meant only for himself. "I'm coming for him." The imperial throne room was a cathedral of cold, oppressive grandeur, vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows, columns of black stone carved with the history of 1,000 conquered worlds. The walls pulsed faintly with veins of energy, casting an eerie, silver light across the chamber. At its center, on a dais raised high above the polished obsidian floor, sat the alien emperor, a figure shrouded in shimmering robes that rippled like liquid night. His crown, an ornate circlet of jagged metal, glowed faintly with runes that flickered as though alive. The emperor's face was hidden behind a mask of gleaming platinum, featureless save for 2 hollow slits where his eyes should have been. Those empty sockets burned with an unnatural light, a predator's gaze, ancient and unknowable. He did not move as Joseph Walker entered the chamber, his boots echoing like gunshots across the empty expanse. Joseph came alone. The heavy doors groaned shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the cavernous room, like the tolling of a great bell. He walked forward with the steady, deliberate pace of a man who had chosen to step into hell. The Emperor's guards, 10 towering beings clad in black armor that shimmered with an unnatural sheen, stepped out of the shadows, plasma pikes humming to life in their hands. They moved to encircle Joseph, their stances precise, practiced, the kind born of centuries of discipline. Joseph stopped halfway across the room. He stood still, his black suit streaked with soot, his knuckles cracked and bloodied. In his hand, he held the alien rifle, charred and dented, nearly empty. He let it drop to the floor. The weapon hit the obsidian with a clatter that seemed far too loud in the vast silence. The Emperor finally stirred. His voice emerged like a low tremor, resonant and ancient, carrying the weight of countless generations of conquest. "You are a singular creature." Joseph said nothing. "You have broken my prison. You have slaughtered my guards. You have freed horrors that I sealed away to protect the galaxy. And all of this," the Emperor's voice darkened, "for vengeance. For pride." Joseph looked up, his eyes locking onto those glowing hollows, unflinching. "It's not pride." The Emperor tilted his head, a slow and deliberate motion, like a beast sizing up prey. "No? Then what drives you, human?" Joseph took another step forward. "You took something that wasn't yours to take. I'm here to make sure you understand that mistake." The guards shifted at that, their grips tightening on their pikes. A single word from the Emperor stilled them. Bold, arrogant, his tone was almost amused, though the air in the chamber seemed to grow colder. "Do you think you can kill me?" Joseph's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Yes." A moment of silence passed, as though even the throne room itself paused to consider the claim. Then the Emperor laughed, a deep, hollow sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the room, rolling like distant thunder. "You are not the first to threaten me. I have crushed entire civilizations beneath my will. You, a single man, are nothing." Joseph met the Emperor's gaze and said nothing, his stillness louder than words. "Kill him," the Emperor commanded. The guards sprang forward, their movements perfectly synchronized, the hum of their pikes rising to a shriek as they descended on Joseph like shadows given form. But Joseph was already moving. The first pike slashed through the air where his head had been moments before, the heat of its energy singeing his collar. He sidestepped into the path of the next guard, his hand shooting out to grip the pike's shaft, redirecting the weapon into the chest of its wielder. The plasma shrieked as it met armor, burning through with a sizzle of molten metal. Joseph ripped the pike free as the guard crumpled, spinning it like a staff. The second blow shattered another guard's visor, dropping him before he could react. A third swung low, trying to cleave Joseph's legs from beneath him, but Joseph vaulted over the strike, driving the blunt end of the pike into the guard's throat as he landed. 3 down, 7 left. The guards moved cautiously now, their formation widening as they assessed him, predator recognizing predator. Joseph's breathing was steady, his grip on the pike unwavering. His movements were methodical, almost surgical, every step measured to control the space around him. The next 2 came at once, one high, one low. Joseph deflected the first blow with a sharp twist of his weapon, sparks scattering across the black floor. The second grazed aside, the searing pain sharp but fleeting. He didn't falter. He dropped low, sweeping the pike in a wide arc that sent both guards sprawling, then drove the weapon into their chests before they could rise. He discarded the weapon now, its shaft cracked, and turned toward the remaining guards. Blood pooled at his feet, steaming faintly in the chill of the room. They hesitated for a beat too long, and Joseph capitalized. He closed the distance in 2 steps, his hands moving like strikes of lightning, disarming one, snapping the neck of another. The last 2 fell in seconds, their armor cracking under the precision of his blows. Silence returned to the chamber. Joseph stood alone, surrounded by the broken remains of the Emperor's elite. Blood stained his suit, dripping from his fingertips. He turned his gaze back to the dais, where the Emperor had not moved. The air trembled. The Emperor rose, his robe flowing like smoke as he descended the steps toward Joseph. Up close, the figure was impossibly tall, the mask's hollow eyes now glowing with an intensity that burned into Joseph's mind. The power radiating from the Emperor pressed against the walls, warping the air, making every breath feel heavy. "You are impressive," the Emperor said, his voice now a low, vibrating growl. "But you are still mortal." Joseph's voice was quiet, deadly. "We'll see." The Emperor raised a hand, and from the depths of his cloak, tendrils of dark energy erupted, twisting, shrieking as they shot toward Joseph like serpents. Joseph moved, his body a blur as he weaved between the black strands, feeling their heat rake across his skin. One tendril lashed his shoulder, tearing through fabric and flesh, but Joseph ignored the pain, pressing forward. He closed the gap between them. The Emperor raised his other hand, energy coalescing into a blade of crackling darkness. He swung it toward Joseph, but Joseph was faster. He sidestepped, seized the Emperor's wrist, and drove his knee into the alien's midsection. The impact was solid, reverberating through the chamber. The Emperor staggered back, his composure flickering. Joseph didn't stop. He lunged, his fist connecting with the Emperor's mask. Cracks spiderwebbed across the polished surface. The alien let out a hiss of rage, his power surging in a final burst, but Joseph ducked beneath it and struck again. His movements were relentless, every punch, every strike carrying the weight of purpose. With a final, shattering blow, the mask split apart. The Emperor fell to his knees, his true face revealed. Something ancient and frail beneath the power, his eyes no longer blazing but wide with disbelief. Joseph stepped closer, bloodied and unrelenting. "I told you," Joseph said, his voice a low murmur. "You shouldn't have taken him." The Emperor's body collapsed lifeless, his energy dissipating like ash in the wind. The throne room fell into utter silence. Joseph Walker turned and walked away, leaving behind only the broken remnants of an empire that had dared to cross him.